It's a real pleasure to have you here, my friend. I feel, we've been connecting a little over the last months, and the opportunity to bring you on and introduce you and your work to our community is a real pleasure. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to speak with you. And I feel honored that you have interest in my work. Yeah, it feels really good. We're on opposite sides of the globe, but there's that connection and the ability for us to actually have conversations and to have a peek into what other guys are doing around the world is really quite amazing, and not something that was so accessible to us just a few years ago. So yeah, I'm always blown away that when guys like you reach out and say, I appreciate what you're doing and here's what I'm doing, and we can have this exchange. It's remarkable.
Yeah, I agree, and your work really resonated with me. I felt like every time I saw one of your new podcasts drop, for example, it was kind of like somebody I'd been thinking about, or a theme I'd been thinking about, and there it was. Brian dropped something in my lap, which was kind of right on point. So I'll go on. Yeah.
I was just going to comment that someone else actually reached out to me today with that exact same comment, that every time a new podcast drops, it's right in line with what they've been exploring. And I think a lot of that has to do with the podcast being led by my own curiosity, as I go along my journey and follow up on some threads. Yeah, so the podcast being led by my own curiosity, being able to connect with other people and hear from them just shows me that when we're following our own curiosity, there's a chance that other people are also on very similar paths, maybe parallel paths that intersect at certain points. And those points of intersection are points of like really deep connection. You could think of it as the collective unconscious, or maybe a cul-de-sac in the collective unconscious that we just both happen to be exploring at the same time. Again, just another affirmation that there is a network of deeper connection that we're all participating in if we're listening and paying attention, to those urges and drives within us. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I really feel that to be true. Tapping into something collective there. It's a beautiful thing. And it's good to see you had a couple of Australians on there too recently. I know the conversation with David Tacey I thought was fantastic. And I really feel like David is one of our hidden gems. He's written so many wonderful books. His Jungian work is just incredible. You kind of giving him a platform to speak like that. He has many, but kind of to this particular community was wonderful. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, I enjoy David. There's an affinity, I think, between Canadians and Australians. We're colonial nations. We're still connected in some way to Great Britain. We both have the Queen on our money. And I think there's something about being outside of the UK, but having those roots there gives us kind of an outsider perspective. Like I find Canadian comedians and Australian comedians to be the most kind of astute observers of dominant culture. And I kind of we both probably grew up watching like Monty Python and things like that. And so there can be like kind of dry sarcasm to our humor. And one of the things I enjoyed about David is he's kind of like a crusty old guy. He's not afraid to tell it like he sees it, and to do that with a sense of humor and self-deprecation that I appreciate. So we got along pretty famously, and we've had a lot of exchanges kind of off the record that are really fun.
No, I agree with that about David, and also what you were saying with regards to Australian and Canadians. I also think we don't mind, poking fun and mocking a little bit, but in the interests of, in the greater interests of change, and I think that's really wonderful. Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if that interest in change is always like a conscious thing or not. I think, for myself, I think I just have a lot of trickster in me that likes to, by poking fun, poke holes in something that seems to me like grandiose or inflated, and
Hmm.
that could be a cultural thing, or it could be a person. But it's gotten me in some trouble over the years. But I've come to appreciate it, that it does have a function that even my ego is not always aware of.
Hmm.
And I make sure that that I'm the subject of some healthy poking every once in a while.
Well, I think we can agree on that. The trickster energy abounds in both countries. There's no doubt about that. So, Brian, just let's take a little step back, and maybe for those that don't know of you and your work, you could maybe just take a moment to kind of explain what it is that you do in the world, and what you're bringing.
Yeah. Well, what do I do in the world? Well, I try to be an advocate for soul first and foremost. And the way that that is expressed is a number of ways. So, one of the ways that you mentioned is the podcast. And that's really sharing conversations that I have with people that I'm interested in. Like I said, at whatever stage on my journey, where my interest is drawing me, I try to seek out people who have kind of been down that road before and might have something to offer. So the podcast was really an extension of my own kind of seeking and learning process. And I just felt that I had the opportunity to meet some really incredible people along the way, uh, for whatever reason. I've always had this ability to connect with people who are, I see as kind of revered teachers, people of wisdom. And it just felt like a kind of a repayment to then share those conversations with others who might also be seeking. So that's one way. And like I said, that's really intertwined with my own journey. So that's a big part of it, is just sharing my journey and these conversations I have with people. The other way is working with people one-on-one, as a, I think of it as a kind of a soul friend and guide. Uh, I've played with different terminology over the years, coach and counselor, uh, but those come with so much baggage and so much kind of professionalism. I really was inspired reading John O'Donohue's book Anamkara, and that whole concept of the kind of the soul friend. That really resonates with me, and that's the kind of role I like to play in other people's lives. Just someone on the path who might be just a few further steps along, who can maybe point some things out along the way, as you travel your medicine path. Just go, hey, you might want to watch out for that, or that fruit over there is pretty tasty, you might want to try that for yourself.
Mm.
I often think about like a jungle guide.
Mm.
I visited places like Costa Rica and South America, and if you're venturing into a jungle that you don't know, it's good to have a guide, someone who knows the territory really well and knows what to point out, both the pitfalls and the fruits along the way. So that's kind of how I see myself in that role. And then maybe the other way is through my artistic and creative expression. So the writing and music making that I do, I try to contribute some beauty to the world. Yeah, and then just trying to be a good neighbor, really, to the people around me.
Mm. Well,
That's maybe the biggest challenge, actually.
yeah, I think yeah, I resonate with that. But that's beautifully articulated, brother. I appreciate that. And when you talk about the friend, it kind of it reminds me of the great Sufi poets in talking about the friend.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of idea of the soul, or at least a guide of the soul. It's a beautiful thing. So
Mhm.
thank you for everything
Like
you do.
a companion even, right? Just to have somebody else there with us on our journey, as we go through these peaks and valleys, right?
Mhm.
Like Rumi, you mentioned the Sufi poets. Rumi, I mean, God, Rumi's the best, isn't he? Like he's just like a field guide for the soul or something. And he had his friend Shams,
Mm,
who he met, and someone who offered him counsel and guidance.
mm,
So I think we all need that, and it can be hard to find. So
mm,
I try to just make myself available, and that's how it started for me.
mm,
It's just going, look, I'm here. This is the work I'm doing. This is what I've been through. If you need some companionship, here I am.
mm. Well, I love that. I love that, brother. And it's interesting, picking up on that Rumi thread that it was when Shams died that Rumi's heart kind of broke open and all those beautiful words poured out. It was
Mm,
grief, it was the beginning of his kind of soul descent, wasn't it? So
mm.
I think the whole thing is just such a beautiful weaving. I guess he entered the dark forest that you talked about earlier, the jungle. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's a beautiful thing. Yeah. And
Well, in that friendship with Shams, actually, another one of his poems comes to mind, or a little piece of it. Out beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And that to me points to, it's kind of a guiding principle in the counseling or mentorship work that I do. It's to try to meet people in that field, out beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing. So beyond judgment, in a place of the heart of acceptance, to meet each other there, so that we can learn how to be ourselves in relationship, which I think is the big goal. Jung called it individuation, which is a bit of a stodgy term, and has maybe too much of the individual in there.
mm,
But I think for me, what that means is, the goal of all of this inner work for me is so that I can actually be my authentic self in relationship with others, which is the big challenge.
mm,
If I'm hiding out in my little hermitage here in my yogic cave, no problem. I can pretend that I'm just being myself and I'm fully authentic. But as soon as I enter into relationship with another person, uh, that's where it's the hardest to maintain that authenticity. And I think for each of us, different kinds of relationships bring that out more. The challenge of that, and
mm,
for me, it's been with other men. Men were the source of my deepest wounds early on, and so really working to be in healthy relationship with other men has been maybe the most profound part of my own healing journey.
mm. Well, maybe you could talk a bit more about that, Brian, because I know you offer um, courses and containers, for men to do the work. And I'm also kind of piggybacking on that idea about it being a place also, out in that field beyond right and wrong. That's where we can come together as men, where there's no judgment. And we can just be, and we can share our stories in a safe way, but in a brave way.
Mm-hmm. Brave way, because perhaps out in that field beyond the ideas of right doing and wrongdoing. Now, I think that's important, is that we're talking about ideas of right doing and wrongdoing. So those are really cultural ideas around morality, I think. Maybe there is something, closer to a truly right and wrong, and how do we discern that? For me, the way to discern it is it serving life, or is it kind of destroying life? That's like the fundamental morality for me, that I can judge most any action from, and feel like I'm in a good place, because I don't think we should throw out judgment. And so part of that, being in that space with other people, men in particular, is also calling out some kind of behavior or belief systems that are not contributing to the good and the beautiful, you could say, or not supporting life in its most creative and nourishing aspects. So that's, I think, where the bravery has to come in, the bravery to speak up if we see something wrong, and the bravery to receive that and to self-reflect and to question, maybe this isn't the best thing to think or to express or to do, right? So just to make that disclaimer. Now, sorry, what was your question?
Well, let me reframe it a little. Your the men's work that you offer, I guess, is where
All right.
I was orientating us. But you work archetypally a lot, don't you? With king, warrior, magician, lover, and those spaces. So I'm interested in, perhaps the men listening might be interested in how that kind of functions for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I had done different kind of forms of men's work over the years, and gone to different men's circles and things like that. And I think those can be really good because those can challenge us in all kinds of different ways. But for me, the way that I work at this point, anyway, I really like the one-to-one work. I think that can really help us to get down to the core of things more quickly. So that's what I've been doing for the past few years. And yeah, I did develop a course based on Robert Moore's work that is for individual men. And it takes place over 6 weeks. And so there's a lot of reading and listening that's a part of that. So there's an educational aspect about it too, because I think particularly the king, warrior, magician, lover model that Robert Moore presented is a really helpful way for men to begin to self-reflect and to orient themselves. It's just really useful. I mean, I don't take it always so literally. I don't I try not to be confined by that model, because of course there's many more archetypes that are alive in us. But I think he did a really good job at identifying these 4 key archetypes in the masculine psyche. So he already laid the groundwork. And, I looked at maybe coming up with my own model and things like that. But I just felt like there is something in the continuity of picking up where he left off in that work. And of course, he wasn't doing that work alone. He was doing it alongside people like Robert Bly and Michael Mead in particular. And so there was something good about that felt good about that, is the continuity, picking up where some of our elders had left off. And so part of that is, when I work with men individually, is really making sure that we bring it on home in their actual lives, and not get lost in the theoretical, the abstract, which I think is one of the pitfalls for a lot of men, especially the men who come to this work. They generally have a lot of magician in them. That's one of their main sources of power, a lot of the guys who are interested in self-development work, because the magician archetype is the one who leads us into the work. It's the part of us that wants to know and to understand, to figure out, to learn different systems and things like that. So the magician archetype is the one who kind of leads us with curiosity into the work, but it can also block us in the work by getting really caught up in the theoretical. So, like I said, part of the program that I've developed for men is the learning part, which satisfies that magician desire for knowledge and accumulating information and all of that. But then, my work, and this I can do really well on a one-to-one basis, is to help take men, help bring it down to earth for them, into their particular lives and circumstance, and talk about their relationships, with their lover, their spouse, their kids, their workmates, whatever's going on in their life. And that's where that challenge part of it comes in, because it's easy for us to stay in the abstract and the theoretical and talk about all these really wonderful, rich Jungian ideas. But when it comes to applying them to ourselves and really taking an honest look at ourselves through this archetypal lens, that can be a lot more difficult and challenging to the magician who wants to remain kind of detached from it all, and analytic. That's easy, and that comes naturally to a lot of us guys. So,
well, it's interesting because, and thank you for those words, because a lot of what you just said lands really deeply with me, and also what I've experienced over the years in men's work. I really feel that. It's interesting you use the word analytic. Even the etymology of that word, which means to sort of take out of the collective and forensically look at. So it almost means to separate.
It does mean to separate, exactly. And I work with the tarot. I think it's just a beautiful collection of archetypal images that can help ground some of these ideas into an image, which people like Jung and James Hillman especially thought was very important, because the psyche speaks in images. It speaks in images through our dreams and our fantasies and imagination. And so having a kind of a book or repertoire of archetypal images, whether they're through cultural stories or things like that, is really important for us to, again, bring it down to earth. And so one of the first cards in the major arcana of the tarot deck is the magician. It's like there's the fool, there's the magician. So the magician is the beginning of the work. And if you look at that image in the classical decks, like the Tarot de Marseille, he's got a table in front of him, his like little alchemist or magician's work table. And he's got a collection of objects in front of him. And he's kind of looking at these objects. So there's that analysis, is the taking apart, the separating out. And in alchemy, that's the first stage too, is the separation stage, because when we come to this work, where what the alchemists called the massa confusa, the confused mess, it's like a congealed ball of memories, experiences, traumas, and gifts, all like in some confused ball. And so the way we have to begin is by like separating things out, putting them on the table so that we can have a clear look at them and decide, what needs to be discarded, what needs to be nourished, what needs to be transformed, all of that. But until that separation happens, there's not a lot of hope for us. So that's where it needs to begin. And I think that happens in my work through the dialogue that I have with people. It's like listening to their stories, and through listening to their stories, listening to some of the patterns of speech. Underlying that are kind of conditioned belief systems at work. And I'll just notice things. Little things will tend to jump out at me, and I'll go, you keep saying this word, or you describe that in this way. Can we just take a little pause and look at that? And so we pull out that little piece, we put it on the table in between us, we have a look at it together. If it's a belief, we go, does this really hold up to any scrutiny, this belief that has just become like an unconscious pattern in you? And we look at it, and oftentimes it's actually no. Now that we like pull it out and we look at it, it doesn't feel true to me. Maybe it felt true to me 20 years ago, but it no longer does. And so that can be transformed or discarded or burned up, whatever needs to be done with it. But that's how it happens for me, is through the dialogue and paying attention and noticing, and just having the guts to maybe interrupt someone and go, I'm getting a little, I call it, I get the yellow flag. It's like the warning, like something in me comes up, like a little caution, and it's asking for a pause, like the yellow light on a traffic signal. It's like, let's slow down here. Let's like be cautious. Let's take a look around. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Again, really feeling into a lot of that. It makes a lot of sense, and as it happens, Brian, we're actually working with the tarot this year, and through one of our through our story session, which we hold weekly. And obviously it was the full in January, and we're working with the magician this month. So to hear you talk so eloquently about the magician is bang on target for us. So thank you. I was going to say that we're actually following the lead from the Joseph Campbell Foundation, who are doing the same thing with their essays and writing this year. So it's been a pleasure.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
See, there's another example of the collective unconscious at work, right? Because January started up, my wife's doing a course with Sharon Blackie, and she's using the Fool's Journey as a guide through this course. And it's a guide through the major arcana of the tarot. And every month, I think she gives out 1 or 2 new cards to contemplate and reflect on. And I was like, that's a really great idea. I think, I should start doing that. And then now you tell me that you guys are doing that this year. Joseph Campbell Foundation is doing it. So there again, it's just like, it's amazing.
It feels good when you hear that, doesn't it? There's some part of you which kind of, it's almost like there's a release, the shoulders drop, and you're like, there's something there. I understand something now.
Well, I understand that I'm not alone in this, that like I am connected to these other people. And until we reveal something of ourselves, what we're interested in, what we've been thinking about, what's lighting us up at the moment, we may not know that there's this other connection. So that's one of the gifts of the vulnerability and the opening up of oneself and sharing with others, is you find out, I'm not alone in this. Other people are being guided toward this too. We're all part of some greater process. And then for me, it's like the affirmation of that. And it also offers some encouragement, like, that was a good instinct. Other people are like already, and for me, it doesn't get into competition. I don't think, well, those guys are already doing it. And, I've got such a small following compared to the Fifth Direction or the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Like, what's the point? But for me, I get more of the encouragement of that. Like, no, take care of your little corner of the world over here, with this like bigger idea that other people have picked up on as well. So yeah, it's kind of exciting.
No, I like that. And, an affirmation for me, for example, when you were talking about King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, because that's something that we also use as a part of our kind of container for men too. And, I can see some of the areas where perhaps, and I can feel the criticism from those that might look at it with more of that, magician's eye sometimes and try to pick it apart analytically. And as you said, there are more archetypes, and, maybe it's not a good idea to sort of codify the archetypes so precisely, but I 100% agree with you. It's such a great foundation to use, and the idea of kind of picking up the baton from those men, Moore and Robert Bly and Michael Mead and so forth. It just feels so good in my bones. And I appreciate so much everything that they've done in more ways than I could explain in this conversation. So it just feels so right to me.
Yeah. And I mean, having some appreciation for all the work that they've done, wouldn't the thing that they would want most from us, wouldn't the best way to honor their work is to continue it, right? And not just regurgitate it, because some of that stuff is a bit outdated. It's just, these are guys from a different generation, so they had a whole different set of cultural reference points. Like when Robert Moore talks about the warrior, for instance, he talks about like the movie Patton, about General Patton, the American general. I don't know about that guy. I don't really care to learn so much about him. He's part of the whole American war machine, and like, I'm going to find other expressions of the warrior archetype that speak to me and people of my generation, perhaps. And that's going to broaden it some more. And I think just naturally start to update the work, or at least the references that we use in order to bring the archetypes alive, for people. So like, for instance, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is full of these great archetypal figures. And it's a really wonderful modern myth that sprang from the same source as the myths of old. I think Tolkien especially was really deeply connected to the archetypal realm. And unlike something like Star Wars, which is also pointed to as a great kind of archetypal reference point, for Tolkien, it wasn't a conscious intention to make an archetypal story. George Lucas talked to Joseph Campbell and said, I want to make something that resonates for modern people. I want to make a modern myth. And Joseph Campbell gave him like the rundown of the hero's journey archetype, and Lucas followed that and the storytelling and everything. Like, it was very calculated to kind of hit all those buttons, Whereas with Tolkien, it just sprang forth from his unconscious. I mean, a whole language system came out of it, a whole mythological culture with songs and poems and a history unto itself. And he was just like dictating really from the unconscious. So therein lies the difference for me. What's a true myth and what's not. When it comes from that deep source and you're just struggling to keep up. I mean, the amount of writing that he did, it was just obviously pouring forth through him, and everything in his life had prepared him to be the dictator of the story, or the scribe, maybe is the better word,
Mm-hmm.
like so yeah, taking the work of those guys, continuing it forward, letting it be refreshed along the way, so not getting so rigid around them as authorities and experts, and kind of concretizing the work, which for them was always evolving and always alive. So like, let's keep it alive. Let's keep, reflecting back and see where these archetypal figures that they were talking about, where they're showing up for us in the here and now. Keep it relevant. That's what's meant to happen, I think.
No, I agree. And I think, for me, one of the things that I've admired about following your work is you how much you've kind of tracked the work of I guess the mythopoetic guys, all the way back. It's wonderful. It really feels like you've got you're looking closely, and picking up all the pieces. And I think that kind of leads into how we started to communicate with one another, which was around your work in archiving those sort of hidden, forgotten lectures from the Alabama Men's Conference. And I really felt something in listening to the passion in your voice and kind of doing that work, which it's certainly not going to be anything that's going to bring you any financial reward, but it feels like it's part of your purpose and part of your what you're bringing, your gift to those that are following in the footsteps of those men. So I want to say thank you for that, but also maybe offer you the opportunity to talk a little bit about what you're doing in that space.
Oh, sure. Thanks for noticing. That feels good, just to have you like notice and appreciate something I've been doing kind of on the side, like, because you said it's a labor of love. Well, I think for my whole life, I could safely say I was always interested in archaeology and anthropology, of like kind of digging through the bones of our ancestors. And being a person who was born in Canada and second or third generation here, there's not a lot of bones of my ancestors here. And because of the nature of my family being quite fractured, it's been really hard to do the archaeology through my personal lineage, the bones of my actual ancestors. It's been a really difficult task. And I may have gotten as far as I could going back 3 generations only, which there's a lot of grief around that. But along the way, what I came to realize was that we all have kind of spiritual ancestors, people who may not be blood related to us, but whose work whether that's creative work or scholarly work, it speaks to us on the level of the soul. It resonates with our bones. And I've been able to identify a handful of people who came before who, when I read their work, I feel that resonance. You know, it's like my bones start humming. And every time I go back to their work, it's like I get re-nourished by it. You know, there's still some food for my soul there. So it's been really important for me to honor those spiritual ancestors by learning about them, trying to get to know them, if they're dead, through the people who knew them. And really, it's like, yeah, their work having like a special place in my library. And so meeting someone like John Lee, who's one of the people who was there at the beginning of the so-called men's movement in the 80s and 90s, a close friend and student, I think, of Robert Bly, and also getting to meet Michael Mead, who also was closely involved in all of that, hearing their stories, and then also hearing their stories about Robert Bly, who passed. And the years before he passed, he was, he had dementia, and so he wasn't public, he wasn't speaking anymore, so basically unavailable. That's felt really important to me personally, just getting to know these spiritual ancestors as well as I can. And I went through the same thing with my yoga lineage as well. And I don't do it for any other reason that it feeds my soul. You know, it helps me feel connected to something greater, to this lineage that I'm just like the kind of most current expression of in this one particular branch, you know, in this place and time. And it's just nice to hear that other people appreciate that too. It's a very small amount of people. Like you said, it's never going to make me rich, but it feels like a way to honor the dead, you know, and those who have kind of laid the soil that I draw nourishment from, you know. And so part of it is keep tending to that soil, keep their work alive in the way that I talked about before. Not holding them up as like kind of religious icons, you know, the way that Carl Jung has, and the way people will want to do with figures who make such an impact on them and the culture, but really trying to just understand them as human people, accepting that they none of them are perfect, but they were tapped into something that is contributing to the greater human culture, in honoring that, you know.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Really, I feel that, you know, and particularly admired the way you handled the passing of Robert Bly and those beautiful tribute conversations that you had with the likes of Michael and John and Martin Shaw and others. It was just beautifully well handled, and I've actually found myself going back to those more than once, which says something. Plenty of things to listen to out there.
Yeah, well, there is, that's for sure. But I'm interested in like what keeps you going back. Like, what does it give you?
Yeah,
Those stories?
It's very similar to the words you were using earlier. It's almost like I need to rehear some of the things that were said to understand more about his life, some of the stories that were shared about, you know, Robert's early life, and it gives you a bit of it gives you such a great insight into a man who means so much to me, who I consider a mentor, who I never met, you know. So there's all these little kind of breadcrumbs that get dropped in those conversations with men that were around him a lot, you know. I feel like bringing up, you know, Walton Stanley and Tim Young, who are obviously very early names and faces with the Minnesota Men's Conference, and having them come and speak to our men once a month at the Fifth Direction is just beautiful, because they drop all these little anecdotes and things that happened. I know you've had them on your podcast as well, so you might feel some of that, but that also helps us feel connected, you know, all the way back into those roots, having those men's energy, their voices and their faces around us, and listening to the old stories. It's just, it really fills me up in the most beautiful way. And I know in speaking to the men in our community that they feel similarly. So yeah, I guess that's all part of it.
Let me check with you on this. This is something, that it gives me hearing those anecdotes. People who are close, like physically close to that person. And having spent time with, one person in particular, an early yoga teacher of mine who took me under his wing and took me around the world and all of that, getting to see who he was off stage, was really revealing to me and instructive. And so one of the things that I get from these personal anecdotes is a humanizing of someone like Robert Bly, who we're talking about. And that, what that does is kind of take the icon off the shelf in a way, which for me is important to always remember that this is a real human man with his own limitations and struggles, as well as all of those gifts, but not lose sight of the other aspects, right? So that kind of takes the icon off the shelf. What it does also is encourage me, because I know most intimately all of my own limitations and foibles and idiosyncrasies and all of that. And if I don't remember, or if I don't even know of the more kind of human aspect of some of these figures, I'll tend to maybe not be so willing to share the gifts that I have, because I might think I'm not worthy. Like, who am I to talk about this? I've got all these problems in my life and I've got still so much work to do. And like, who am I to talk to people about these things, or to, so that's a big part of it for me too, is the humanization, the relatability. It also serves as a kind of encouragement, that you don't have to be a perfect person, completely integrated, all those other fantasies that we can be blocked by, blocked in sharing the gifts that we do have to offer. Maybe the little bits of wisdom that we might have picked up along the way, or might have, blossomed in our own soil, that are unique. Like, oh my God, can you imagine? You might actually have a unique bit of wisdom to share with the world, just like a Robert Bly or James Hillman or Michael Mead or whoever, a Rumi. Just imagine that you might have something in you that is bursting through the soil at this particular time and place for a reason. A bit of wisdom that Robert Bly or Michael Mead or whoever couldn't have had, because they weren't you growing in the soil in which you were planted, right? Like, what a terrifying but liberating idea to just ponder that you might have something really unique and original to offer the world.
And isn't it interesting?
How many times do you get told that growing up?
Yeah, I know, that's right, Brian. And isn't it interesting that understanding of what's possible for you comes from looking at the imperfection of the people that you look up to, not their kind of not the other side of it, all the beautiful, amazing things they say when they're tapping into their genius. It's actually looking at them as just a regular human being and seeing some of their flaws and imperfections that makes you realize all that. So I think that's wonderful.
What it can do, having a more complete picture of the person, can kind of dim the light enough emanating from that figure that your own light can then find a place in the world. Because otherwise it's just blinding and you're just dumbfounded by it. You're kind of arrested by it. You're stopped from doing your little piece of work in the world, maybe, right? I think that's a pretty common experience for a lot of people. So I'm saying, like, see them as human beings. It dims the light a little bit, maybe so that little ray of light from in your soul can shine into the world, because it's there and it's meant to be shone into the world. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here.
Mm.
End of
You know,
story.
yeah, one of the little documentaries that I saw, which really taught me that lesson, was A Literary Friendship. And it's the conversation between Robert Bly and William Stafford. And it's very raw. It's very, it
Oh,
almost looks like that they're not even aware that the camera's in the room at some points. And
wonderful.
they're just, shooting the shit and being a couple of guys. And it just, me looking up to Bill Stafford as a poet, and obviously everything around Robert Bly, just to see two guys just talking like that, and it just made me realize what's possible for me, and all in all the
Yeah.
ways that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Bly, I mean, this is one of the reasons why he's got a very prominent place on my tree. James Hillman talked about the idea that we all need to find out what tree we're on. And that will help us navigate all of the books, videos, all of the stuff out there. If we start doing this kind of work, we're inundated with teachers and experts and traditions, practices, all of it. It's just too much. It can be overwhelming. So a great first step is to just start to figure out who's on your tree. Like when you read that person or listen to their voice, does it start that humming in your bones? Do you feel that resonance? Are they some kind of spiritual ancestor or brother or sister? Start to figure that out. So Bly's got a prominent place on my tree for the reason you just described. He was so natural and human and willing to show himself. He never, to me, came across as an authority or expert. He was always engaged in wondering aloud with other people. And I go back to those conversations all the time too. There's some great ones that he did with a guy on a radio show called New Directions. And you can get these on Audible. And I was just re-listening to a couple of them. And very much he's engaged in a conversation with this person who's supposed to be interviewing the expert. And he's asking him his opinion on things and like, well, like, what do you think about this? And I just love that. It just dismantles the whole idea of the expert and the authority, which in my opinion, we just have far too much of these days. So I find it very refreshing and encouraging. Like, just be yourself. Don't try to be the expert. Don't try to be the know-it-all. Just be curious and open about the curiosity.
I love that. I love that, Brian. There's one particular moment in one of those interviews that I remember so clearly, and Bly was telling a story or a piece of a story, and when he finished it, there was just a pause, and he just said, "I have no idea what that means." And it's like just this wonderful moment,
Yeah.
He was just curious, and that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Look, I'm noticing the time. If you
Yes.
want to continue for a little bit, maybe we can wrap it up nicely or try to. But before we do that, I just got to run to the washroom. So can we take a little pause?
Let's take a break and just close up with another couple of minutes. That'd be great.
Great. All right.
I'm going to pause. Yeah, I was going to ask you, Brian, I'll do some cuts so we can just have a little side chat here, but I was going to maybe finish up with asking you a bit about the wild man archetype that you're working on. Is that maybe a final thing that we could mention before we close off?
Yeah.
Or is there not enough there for you at the moment? It's just a thought.
No, but that's maybe a good place to kind of leave it, is where's the inquiry? Where's my curiosity leading me right now?
Yeah.
At this moment, so I'd be happy.
All right. Well, let me dive into that one. So Brian, I'm noticing that the time, and it's been beautiful chatting with you, but in coming to a conclusion, I wanted to ask you kind of where next, what's alive in your heart right now, and where are you feeling drawn?
Yeah, thanks. And when you proposed the idea that you have me on to talk about my work, you asked that question, what's alive for you right now? And my response was a typical response from me. It's like, well, who cares about what's alive just in me, right? I'm more interested in finding out what's alive between us. And so I kind of put it back on you as the host, like, you lead this, and like, let's not go in with an agenda. It's that coming from that kind of place. But then that your question kind of like kept working on me. And then I think a couple of days later, I said, okay, well, look, I'm kind of interested in this particular subject right now, and maybe that's something we could explore. And you responded with, well, yeah, that's really interesting to us too at this time. So what I've been thinking about lately is, okay, what's the way to set it up? I guess through my work with men particularly, but also with women and young men, it became really apparent to me that there was something that isn't being properly addressed in our culture or in the world of self-development and in men's work, I think. I could be wrong about that because I don't know everything that's going on out there, but just in terms of what I've been able to witness, there's a lot of talk out there about the hero's journey and initiation into manhood, right? There's been a lot of work done about that. It's all over the internet, all over people's Instagram posts and YouTube videos and everything. And then there's more work in the past few years around elderhood. But for me, there hasn't been a lot of focus on what comes between those two stages. So what comes after the hero's journey of the initiation into full adult manhood, right? For us guys, what does it mean to be a man and all of that stuff? Been a lot of work done around that. And then more and more work around the kind of what Robert Bly called father hunger, hunger for elders. Guys of our generation have, I think, been taking that up more and more. Having come from, what we call here in North America, the boomer generation, it was like really the me generation. A lot of our older people, they retire. And in the true sense of the word, is they retreat from culture, they retreat from community and society, and they go have an extended childhood in places like Mexico or Arizona or wherever, Florida. So it's left us with this real need and hunger for elders. But that still leaves that time in between, in the middle age of a man's life. And we can tell that there's a need not being met by simply the disease, what they call diseases of despair. So the addiction, the depression, and suicide rates among middle-aged men are the highest of any other demographic. 70% of all suicides in the US in 2020 were middle-aged, quote unquote, white men. The people who are supposed to be at the top of the heap, according to kind of dominant narratives right now. Well, obviously that's not the case. Something's going on there. And so the question that arises for me is, what's missing in a middle-aged man's life that would cause him to descend into addiction and depression and suicide? And I think it's a lack of guiding stories for that stage of a man's life. So I was thinking about it and looking around, like, have any of our elders really talked about this? And I found that anytime somebody of the previous generation, anytime they talked about mentorship, it was always about what it gave the young man and the necessity for mentorship in a young man's life. But it's clear that these middle-aged men are really at risk. So we always talk about at-risk youth and helping them out and all that. But what about the at-risk middle-aged man who obviously is lacking a sense of purpose and meaning in his life? Otherwise, we wouldn't have the addiction and depression and suicide, right?
Mhm.
So we're starting to set this up like there's a missing need here for a guiding story, and at the root level of the story is always an archetype. So what's the archetype that uh, is missing at this stage of a man's life? So following that, I've started to get a sense, well, I think it has something to do with what's been called the wild man archetype, which immediately brings up all of these different images and ideas. Many of them I think are misleading. So I'm interested, when I mentioned, I'm curious about maybe exploring the wild man archetype. Just immediately, what does that bring up for you? What kind of associations do you have to this term?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's probably around reconnecting to my primal side. I start thinking about Martin Shaw's work around the wild twin. This part of me that I've kind of left out in the forest to fend for itself, which is kind of full of my wounds in a sense, and obviously, clearly, the story of Iron John.
Mhm. Yeah, the hairy wild man in the woods.
Correct, at the bottom
Who,
of the bottom of the lake. Yeah.
Yeah, who's been submerged in the pond, out of sight, out of mind. Um, that's where I was led to, is thinking about particularly Bly's work around the wild man, Iron John, Iron Hans. Uh, the thing about him, though, is he's still pretty wild, right? Like in the wild man in different cultural stories and depictions was often seen as not a part of the community at all. I mean, he was literally a man living like a wild beast in the forest. And if we think about a figure like Pan, uh, he's keeping something alive, keeping something of the wild alive, but not integrated into the community because he's just too wild. But he's there, and maybe once a year they would have a festival where they'd invite the wild man into the festival, just as a reminder that at our core, we are still wild, but not integrated, allowed in once a year. And so I think, what I've been kind of getting to is that there's the wild man is maybe one stage in what needs to happen in a man for him to be a mentor. And so I've been focusing in more on the mentor as a role, as an archetypal figure, and doing some wondering about that. What is it that makes a mentor? What does the man acting as mentor get from the mentoring relationship? We know what the young man gets from it. We know what need is being filled there. But I'm saying that the man acting as mentor gets something necessary from that relationship as well. Something that will give him that sense of purpose and meaning in his life that will keep him from falling into absolute disrepair. So I think reclaiming the inner wild man, that part of it, that's an aspect of it. But I think he has to evolve somewhat so that he can be actually integrated into the community. So when I think about the wild man, I immediately associate it with those stories surrounding the men's movement of the 80s and 90s. People from the outside hearing about it and just picturing men getting naked in the woods, playing drums and screaming and shouting. And that's not untrue. A lot of that did go on, but there was a lot more going on. There was the kind of there was a refining of that happened actually when you really got into it. I mean, the true kind of primal wild man of the woods, he's not interested in poetry or music or anything like that. He's living like a wild animal, it's not safe to have him in the village. So what happens when the wild man kind of evolves and becomes more integrated in a man? I think what we get is the mentor. So looking at, well, Lord of the Rings, for instance, Gandalf, classic mentor, and very much someone who's integrated the wild man. He's got a wild aspect to him. You know, where's Gandalf's home? We don't know. He's kind of wandering around. He's quite at home in the wild. We see him shape-shifting, communicating with animals and creatures. He's got that, but he's also more refined. You know, he's able to come into the village and serve a role and all of that. He's interested in more than just his own survival and thriving. You know, he's got that elder quality in him that is interested in upholding the good in all. You know, peace and harmony in the kingdom and all that stuff, right? So Gandalf is there. I got Gandalf in my sights going, but he's still kind of old. I don't know. Is he the old wise man? I don't know. Merlin is another figure that I'm getting really curious about exploring more deeply. Merlin started out as a warrior in service to the king. When the king was killed in battle, the Welsh king, so this comes from the Welsh tradition around Myrddin or Merlin. After the king was killed in battle, Myrddin's grief was so great that he had to retreat into the woods, and there he went mad. So he went wild, but he didn't stay there. You know, in the stories, he then ended up being a mentor to young King Arthur. So Merlin, I think, has got something to tell us there. There's a story to be told there for middle-aged men about the journey through grief, the retreat into the wild, the getting in touch with your natural side more, but then coming back, you know, with something to offer. The other aspect of the mentor that I think about is mastery. The mentor has gone through life. He's lived the first half of his life gaining mastery in some area of life. He's done his 10,000 hours in at least one area. So he's got something valuable to pass on, to teach. So men who haven't got that, I'm not sure what they think they're offering, you know. So that's an integral aspect of the mentor, is mastery. Having integrated his wild nature, right? That's another piece of it. What else was I thinking about? I mean, maybe I had a couple more notes here. Yeah, that he embodies authenticity. I mean, that's part of embracing the wild man, is embracing your authenticity, right? Giving less fucks about what other people think about you. You know, how you dress, how you wear your hair, how you speak, all of that, right? I think that's a big part of it. The living outside of the village, or we could think more broadly, living outside of culture, like just on the outskirts. You always find that in these stories. He's never so far out that you can't find him. He's just outside enough to not be conditioned or conform to the expectations of the civilization, but he's close enough that you can access him. You know,
Mead talks
like
about
Michael,
the 1 foot in, 1 foot out, Brian. You know, one foot in the domesticated, 1 foot in the civilized, and one in the uncivilized. That's kind of where this mentor sits. You know, and I really like that kind of image.
Yeah, that's very much like the shamanic archetype. 1 foot in this world, 1 foot in the other world. The ability to bring things back and forth between the two worlds, right? In the Water of Life, Mead tells a story, an old Irish tale about a young prince, and you know, he's going through his kind of initiatory journey, and you know, apropos of the hero's journey and that whole archetype, he meets his mentor, and he's a druid in the hut just on the outside of town. So he's a kind of natural magician, like a shaman, living on the outside of town. And I think that's an important point, because mentorship, I think, needs to happen outside of the family home. It needs to be someone outside of that unit, because another aspect of the mentor that I think is important is helping the younger person break free of the familial and cultural conditioning in order to find who they really are, right? So that person, the mentor, has to be outside of that in order to challenge it. If you're too close, say, to the father and mother of the young person, and you start challenging the status quo with that young person so that they can be free to be themselves and make up their own mind and all of that stuff, find their own path, mom and dad likely aren't going to be too happy about that, because the young person may become more non-conforming and disruptive to the family unit, right? But that needs to happen in order for the young person to discover their original medicine or their genius. So the mentor has to be just on the outskirts, right? So
they
it
also
could
have
be
to have less investment in, the mum and the dad are too interested in their son or daughter's safety. I think the mentor has less interest in their safety and more interest in their potential, and that means taking a few risks, which may not sit well with the parents.
Well, and the parents have too much invested in their own ideas about right doing and wrong doing, their dreams and expectations for this person they see as an extension of themselves. So for that young person to be planted in their own soil and grow into their fullness, there needs to be a severing of that, that entanglement. And the mentor who's just outside of that bubble, or is able to do that in some way and to encourage that person's growth. So these are some of the things I've been thinking about lately, and I want to develop it more. There's not a lot, so I'm looking for work that has already gone over this. Michael Mead has been pretty good about that, although again, he focuses more on what the young person gets from the mentorship. I don't know if he's seen the necessity for middle-aged men to be a mentor. So I'm looking into this right now. So that's kind of what's alive, but I think there's something really important about that. Like, what are middle-aged men missing that's causing them so much despair? What story, what archetype isn't being held up and offered to these men?
Well, there's so much there that resonates with me, brother. So I really appreciate you sharing that, kind of looking at what's on the edge of where you're going with your work. And I think that, everything you said there makes a lot of sense to me, at least anyway. It's interesting because as you were speaking about kind of your thoughts on the wild man, I'm currently doing a lot of work personally with with Gilgamesh. And the idea of Enkidu came up for me, and whether he kind of fitted that role in terms of the way you're perceiving the wild man, which was interesting to me. And the other thing that came up was Bly often talks about, you were talking about, what does the mentor receive in this relationship? And I often remembered Robert talking about, the blessing goes both ways. The mentee is blessing the mentor just as much as the mentor is blessing the mentee. So I think that's really important to me, to understand that the energy flows both ways.
Yeah, but what is the blessing the mentor is receiving? Like, to use our magician analytical facility, I get curious, like, okay, it sounds nice. The blessing goes both ways. Oh, how poetic. Oh, I just want to like soak it up. But I actually go, but what is the blessing here? And so let's try to understand that. And for me, the way to understand it is to look at what obviously is missing for men at this stage of life. you know, and what's causing them to commit suicide at higher rates than anybody else.
Mm.
So that's part of it, the purpose and meaning they get from the relationship. And that takes away any expectation of the young person to do some kind of blessing or acknowledgement of the mentor, right? It doesn't put that burden on them, which is something that I've seen can happen in some of these men's spaces, is the young men end up having to bless these older men who haven't received a blessing previous to that relationship. So that brings up another essential aspect of a good mentor in my books, is they have to have undergone some kind of apprenticeship or mentorship of their own earlier in life and receive that blessing.
No, I like that.
In a way that was just organic, you know, not as part of some like initiatory weekend, you know, gaze into this other man's eyes and give them the blessing they didn't get when. No, I don't think that actually works, to be frank. It's kind of play acting in some aspects, and I don't know, that may be controversial, but just from what I've seen, it has to have happened. So what I encourage men to do, and I can tell you every man I've ever met has received this blessing and probably just not recognized it because they were looking for something grand, like, you know, the way these things are built up in certain men's circles, right? The blessing of the elder, and they maybe bring out the Excalibur sword and some older man puts in a, you know, I've seen all this stuff, right? It's kind of LARPing the blessing, role playing. So here's what I encourage, and this is maybe where we can end it. Man or woman, whoever you are listening to this, go back through your history and try to identify moments of little blessings. So anytime somebody other than your mother and father saw something in you, saw the gold in you, admired it, drew it out of you, encouraged you to follow that talent or whatever it was, I can tell you, you probably wouldn't be listening to this unless you had received that from someone. And it may have just been a little thing, you know, a little pat on the back, a look, a few words, but really try to sift through your history and identify some of those moments and just kind of separate them out for a little while and just hold them up and acknowledge them, and just acknowledge them. Just start with that. I won't ask you to do anything more, but just look for those little moments, you know, the little mentoring moments in your life. And then what that will do is, you know, hopefully open you up to some gratitude, and honoring of that person and that little gesture they made. But then it may also encourage you to offer out those little mentoring moments to others. Like, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It's recognizing the gold in someone and just going, you know what, that's great. You know, I'd love to see more of that, or some, you know, simple. Everybody can do it. And I think more people should.
Well, thank you. Thank you, brother. You know, I think you're right. It's a wonderful place to end it. So let me just say, I've really enjoyed this conversation, Brian. I hope there are many more.
Me too.
And, yeah,
We were supposed to do a half an hour, and here we are, an hour and a half later. See, once we get going.
I know. We should have known that up front. But thank you, brother.
This is
I
great.
really appreciate your time.
Oh, I'm so grateful for you inviting me and to drawing some of this out of me. You know, some of these things that have just been kind of rattling around in my brain. It's really nice to have someone to, you know, it's like we open up a channel and something can come forth in that channel. And that's what this opportunity's been for me. And I'm really grateful for it.
Thank you.